Hello BookTube, it's Ben here from the History Fella channel. What I thought I'd do today is one of my first bookshelf tours. Show you some of the books that I've got. As most of the books I own are either like World War II or US Civil War type books. We're going to start off with World War II ones. I've got a pile here from my first shelf. There's 20 books. They're all World War II. Most of them are either published by Frontline Books, Pen and Sword Books. Got one by Crown here, and also there's one by Greenhill Books as well, but I can let you know them when we come to them. If I look a bit lighter in this video, it's because I've got these books from just in front of me on the shelf there, so removing them is letting the light in from the window, so that's why it looks a bit brighter. Anyway, let's get started. The first book is Invading Hitler's Europe. That's by Roswell K. Doherty. From Salerno to the Capture of Goring, the memoir of a US intelligence officer. That's basically Roswell Doherty. I think he's a second lieutenant. Yeah, second lieutenant, and joins the US Army in World War II. And as an intelligence officer, part of his unit, they make their way up through Italy, with the Italians on one side and the British making their way up on the other side. I mean, eventually they get all the way through Italy, obviously, and then make it and head towards Germany. So that's a really interesting book, and especially if you want it from an American point of view. That's from Frontline Books, and that's £25. That's Invading Hitler's Europe. The second book is Public Schools and the Second World War, written by David Walsh and Anthony Selden. That's thick. It's about 350 pages long, and it basically looks at the role of the public school sector in the Second World War, their influence, like in the army and the various arms of the forces. So you've got the Navy and the RAF as well, and it just looks at how if you went to a public school, then you were more likely to get accepted or taken straight into the officer class. And it looks at the effects in the various branches of the armed forces and the influence of certain public schools, and the students that have moved up, and even some of the teachers that worked in the public school went on to join the army, and how they've influenced the forces and life in Britain afterwards to a certain standard, and certain things in life became the norm, sort of thing. The next one is Nazi prisons in the British Isles. Political prisoners during the German occupation of Jersey and Guernsey, 40 to 45. And that's written by Gilly Carr. A Pen and Sword book, and it's basically a look at, because the Germans obviously captured a couple of small islands in the south of Britain during World War II, which was obviously, as it says, Jersey and Guernsey, and it's like a different look at how how British prisoners were treated by the Germans and the buildings they were used to house them during the war, and what effect it had on like the local population and things like that. But it's it seems a strange title, like it might be a bit boring, but it's actually quite an interesting book, and it looks at the specifically at the political prisoners and the influence they had on the surrounding population who still lived on the island but under Nazi rule. The next one, that's Stalag XXA and the Enforced March from Poland, written by Stephen Wynne and published by Pen and Sword Books. I really enjoyed this book. For some reason I quite enjoy prisoner of war camps type books. In fact, I've got another book coming up in this pile which is similar, and it's also written by the same person. But I'm not sure why I find it fascinating. Maybe it's like quite a few of the World War II films you see were always, you know, about prisoner of war camps and that sort of thing. But there's really always some interesting pictures in these books. And this obviously centres around them making those that were captured walk from Poland to Germany. And obviously, you know, it was never an easy walk. And it talks about all the suffering that went on. Next one, I should say a couple of these books I haven't read yet, but I will do. This is one of those I haven't read. This is Ben McIntyre, called Rogue Heroes. The history of the SAS, Britain's secret special forces unit that sabotaged the Nazis and changed the nature of war. So I'm presuming this is lots of stories about the SAS and what they were doing during the war, probably in Northern Africa and Europe. I think this one and the next one are the other two that I haven't got around to reading yet, but they look interesting. Here we have The Second World War, Tank Crisis, written by Dick Taylor, and the subtitle is The Fall and Rise of the British Armour, 1919 to 1945. I think it's basically a look at as Britain invented the tank. We might have done that, yet we've never really been good at it, and we've never really had a really good or world-renowned tank design that was British. So I'm presuming this is the story of that and why it's been so hard to do. That one's also a pen and sword book. Dunkirk to DDay. That's the men and women of the RAOC and rearming the British Army, by Philip Hamlin Williams. This is the other one I haven't read, so if I read you the back bit. At Dunkirk, the British Army had lost most of its equipment. Yet of D-Day, only 4 years later, Max Hastings would write in Overlord, "To almost every man of the Allied armies, the predominant memory of the campaign, beyond the horror of battle, was the astounding efficiency of the supply services. None of this happened by accident. It was by dint of hard work, a willingness to learn from mistakes, and an openness to new ideas. This is the story of the men and women who rearmed the British Army." And that's basically because the Dunkirk evacuation, Operation Dynamo, was an operation because the British Army had been forced back to the sort of the edge of France and to Dunkirk, and in order to save a huge number of soldiers, they were forced to retreat back, where they were then taken by many little ships and boats back over to Britain. But obviously they were having to leave behind lots of vehicles, Land Rovers, vans, trucks, tanks, lots of bits of military material. And I think probably that book looks at how everything was sort of rearranged and rebuilt, and how they managed to supply the services to carry on the war effort. So actually, I think that would be quite a good one I'll probably enjoy. I also enjoyed Logistics in World War II, and that's also a book that looks at how the British Army uses supply and demand, and how they get equipment and men and all the little things like food and first aid and equipment and ammunitions, and how they move that around in wartime, and especially on the battlefield. Right, the next book is The Secret War Against the Arts. How MI5 targeted left-wing writers and artists from 36 to 56, by Richard Knott. It's another pen and sword books, and kind of really, as the title says, it looks at how the secret services, especially MI5, were targeting people who were like actors, artists, authors, and how it monitored them, and how they thought they were more likely to be secret agents or spies and hand secrets over to the other side. So that looks at them. And we have Barbed Wire Blues by Bernard Harris. That's also by Pen and Sword Books, and it's at $19.99. This is a book about a soldier. Let me go by memory here. If I remember right, he was shot between the eyes, which kind of blinded him. But he was eventually evacuated out to a hospital. I think it was might have been Greece. And he was obviously put in a prisoner of war camp. But doctors managed to save one of his eyes. And then he took it upon himself to organise like the entertainment side of things, and an orchestra, and like a band, where they would do plays and concerts and do the singing and that. And he took it upon himself to kind of raise the morale of his fellow prisoners and the guards, in order just to make things better. But that's a really interesting book, and something I hadn't heard of before. Next is a recent book, which is called Bletchley Park's Secret Source, and that's by Peter Hall, Churchill's Wrens and the Y Service in World War II. These are the women who, if you've heard of Bletchley Park, that's where they solved the Enigma code, and where now you can visit. And it's like a little museum where you can see lots of Enigma machines and learn how they crack the code. Where you had like Alan Turing and, you know, the main men, these women, were the all the women that did all the jobs in the background. They would help crack all the codes, send information, receive information in, and that's it's a unique new perspective on the Allied war effort during World War II. Has first-hand accounts from the Wrens of the Y service, details of the training and operational roles of the Wrens, and of the sacrifice their tasks entailed for some of them, an insight into the secret workings of the network behind Bletchley Park's war-winning decryptions. Next one. US tanks, 1939 to 45, written by Charles C. Roberts Jr. It's another pen and sword books, but it looks at the American airborne divisions that would use tanks, but because these were the tank, they wanted to get behind enemy lines, but they also needed some decent firepower. They needed to take tanks with them, but this is a book about the smaller tanks they had to take and design, and the effect that they had on in helping the war effort. So it's quite an unusual book. There probably isn't many of this particular subject around, but that's the smaller tanks that they would use. The US airborne tanks, 39 to 45, and that's pen and sword books again. Actually it's Frontline Books, that one. That one's Charles C. Roberts Jr. And we have Ian Fleming and SOE's Operation Postmaster, written by Brian Lett. The untold top secret story, and if people amongst you will remember Ian Fleming, he invented he wrote the first James Bond, and it was the idea for James Bond came from him, and they say that because of his roles in the British Army and the operations he took part in were the basis for coming up with James Bond. But I think that a really good book, tells you about Operation Postmaster. Not one of the well-known stories, and to be honest, there are more exciting operations that happened.